Great to have you with us tonight. Well, the TPPA, what is it? Why do we care? Why should you care? Tonight, Labour's Trade and Export spokesman is David Parker. He's in Christchurch to discuss exactly that, and he joins me this evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thanks for your time tonight. Confusion over whether Labour actually supports the TPPA or not, yes or no?
Well, we're a pro-trade party, but we're not necessarily in support of the TPP or opposed to it. Depends on its actual terms. We've laid out a number of conditions that have to be met for it to get our support. We think they're reasonable terms, and if they can be met, then we would support it. And if they can't be met, well, we think it's not overall in the best interest of the country.
I want to come to those conditions shortly, but the TPPA, how do we get people excited? And I suppose the fundamental question is, why should we care?
Well, New Zealand's a trading nation. We produce a hell of a lot more milk than we can drink. We've got to sell it to the rest of the world in order to pay for the things that we like to use, like the cars and TVs and other things we import. So our exports are crucially important to the health of our economy and the jobs that we sustain in our country. So if you can have trade agreements that reduce the tariff barriers and the other barriers that we face in other countries, then the value of our exports to our New Zealand exporters go up. We earn more as a country, we're wealthier as a country, we have better paid jobs. So trade's a good thing.
But there's the troubling aspect, though, to your answer, isn't it? Because it's a mixed answer. It's yes and no at the same time, because we don't know the details. That's part of this entire problem, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. Life's complex. One of the criticisms that we make of the government is that they've been less transparent than was the case when the last Labour government negotiated our free trade agreement with China.
But is that their fault, though?
It is, yeah. One of the reasons why there is so much suspicion, some of which may be warranted, some of which is probably unwarranted, is because the government hasn't been transparent enough about what this agreement means for New Zealand.
They would say because they can't. Others would say, trust them until it's signed and it'll be a good deal. I mean, the problem is, do you really believe that the government would sell New Zealand down the road?
I believe that they're sometimes incompetent, yeah. I believe they have the best interests of New Zealand at heart, as most politicians do, but they make mistakes. Let's take the recent agreement that was signed with South Korea. In that agreement, they give away the right to ban foreigners from South Korea buying New Zealand houses. That flows through to the Chinese Free Trade Agreement. Now, I believe as a personal value that houses should be owned for New Zealanders, by New Zealanders for New Zealanders. If you've got the right to live here, you've got the right to buy here. So if in a trade agreement the government binds or pretends to bind a future government from banning overseas buyers of our houses, that's wrong. And that's what they've done in the South Korean Free Trade Agreement. It's one of the things we hear they've done wrong in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and so that's one of our bottom lines.
Have you phoned up the Trade Minister and said, what's the deal, what's going on?
Well, he did at one stage offer me a confidential briefing, and I said, look, if you're not going to be transparent with the rest of New Zealand and you get this wave of opposition to your agreement, you're not going to bring me in as a secret insider and get me to carry that burden as well, because he should wear on his head the consequences of not being transparent. In Europe, they've got a similar agreement being negotiated with America, and they've said in respect of every chapter of this agreement, they will set out their principal objectives. And once they have made an offer, and everyone else in the agreement knows about their offer, they'll let the offer be known to their own public, because how can there be downside in that? They've already told the negotiating party, why can't they tell the people who elect them?
OK, so you accept that trade is a good thing, right? We need more trading partners, good for the backbone of our economy. But you say Labour will support this agreement with conditions. Yeah. So let's discuss the intricacy of those conditions then. Yeah. What are they?
5 main conditions. The first is they shouldn't undermine the model, the Farm Act model, nor cause its costs to increase unduly. And
but the Prime Minister has come out recently and said, yeah, there is a risk that medicines may be more expensive. Don't worry, we'll pick up the tab. Yeah.
Well, there are two parts to that. One, the reason that we have affordable medicines in New Zealand is Farm Act can bulk buy, including generics. So if patents last longer, then drugs aren't available in generic form and you have to buy the more expensive patented form for longer. So the bulk buying model, it sounds like the government's not going to trade that away. That might have been at risk, but the government looks like it could have done an okay job in preserving that. How long the patent extensions will be, we don't know until we see the text. If they were hugely long, then the cost of medicines would go up so much that we wouldn't be able to afford as much medicine in our health system, and that would be a bad thing. So we've got to wait to see the details. So that's one condition. The second one is land. It's a really important one. My forebears certainly came to New Zealand to escape a country where they had absentee landowners and where they were tenants in their own country. In New Zealand, we've got the lowest rate of home ownership since the 1950s, and it's going down. And we've got the highest rate of overseas ownership in our farms that we've seen for a century. Those sorts of things have to be able to be pushed against by government regulation, saying these things should be priced within the means of New Zealanders. So there's two conditions. I can run through the others if you want.
Of course, that's why you're here.
Okay, well, another condition is we think that the trade access and the reduction in tariffs should be similar to that which we achieved in the China Free Trade Agreement. Now, currently, some of the tariffs that our exporters, take dairy for example, they pay more than 100% import tax when those goods are sold into Japan or into Canada. That reduces the price that our farmers get. If those tariffs were lower in those countries, more of the sale price would come back to New Zealand. So we think that there must be some substantial tariff reductions, and we don't know that we're going to get those yet.
The thing is, they don't sound like unreasonable conditions, but you don't know that they're not already being put in place, do you?
No, we don't, because there's a lack of transparency. They're not unreasonable. We achieved every one of these in our China agreement.
Does it give you some heart, though, that negotiations stalled last week because of New Zealand? New Zealand saying, does it give you some heart that perhaps we are punching above our weight?
Well, we should certainly stand up for the rights of a New Zealand government to govern in the interests of New Zealand. Whether they're doing that properly, I don't know. You know, maybe one of the problems is that Minister Grosser insulted the Canadians, a little while ago, and maybe they've got their nose out of joint. Maybe it truly is, as the newspapers report, that the Canadians got an election coming in Canada, and that's the thing that's stopping their officials being a bit more reasonable. We're blind. We don't know until we see the agreement.
In trade deals, there's always a trade-off. Right.
Yeah.
Prime Minister John Key was in, I think, South Canterbury or North Canterbury not too long ago saying, this is going to be great for farmers. If this deal is essentially good for farmers, but perhaps there is a trade-off when it comes to perhaps drugs, the Prime Minister has already said, as you know, that they'll fund whatever they need to fund to make sure that it doesn't hurt New Zealanders.
No, he hasn't quite said that. He said the cost of prescriptions won't go up. He hasn't said that Pharmac would get the extra money needed to meet the full range of medicines.
Indeed, but he did give the impression, though, that there won't be an additional cost to the consumer of drugs.
But they might not be able to get the drugs they need. So they might have a smaller basket of drugs that they can get for a normal prescription charge, and some of the drugs that people sometimes need might not be within the purchasing arrangements of Pharmac. It would be very easy for the Prime Minister to actually clear that up right now and say, no, if there is an additional cost to Pharmac, we will fund it. But he hasn't said that yet. OK,
got to take a break. Plenty to discuss on the program, the housing crisis. What are Labour's solutions? That's next. Welcome back to Lynched. My guest tonight is Labour's David Parker. David, let's talk about housing. In an editorial in the New Zealand Herald, you said New Zealanders are suffering because the wealthy 1% from other countries buying our houses are driving up prices to local levels, levels that locals can't afford. How do you know that?
Because we know that there are unprecedented amounts of money awash around the world. Some of it's slopping into New Zealand. It's buying up lots of houses.
Isn't that just called global economic terms?
It's a change. When I grew up, and I've got a few grey hairs now, so it's a couple of decades ago, but virtually no houses were owned by overseas people, and houses were priced within the means of New Zealanders to buy. Since then, we've seen the rich 1% of the world, all around the world, getting hugely wealthier. It's true in New Zealand. It's even more true overseas in countries like China, in countries like the United Kingdom, throughout Europe, and certainly in the USA. And that top 1% are now looking for things to invest in around the world, and they've got lots of different reasons. Some of them are trying to get money beyond the control of their local government. Some of them just want to spread their range of investments. Some of the money is corrupt. It's actually been earned through corruption in other overseas countries.
It's a fine balancing it, though, isn't it? Because you still want money to come into the country, but you said also in your opinion piece that it doesn't actually help the economy. How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, if it's just going into speculating in asset prices and driving up the value of existing assets, it doesn't add to productive output. Change the owner of a New Zealand farm that's already a good, well-developed farm, and you don't get any more milk solids or lamb or anything else off it. You just change who owns the product of it rather than changing the product mix of New Zealand. One of the problems that we've got in New Zealand is that in the last few years, and indeed it was a problem even when we were in government, albeit not quite as bad as it has become since, is that you see these huge increasing house prices that are unaffordable to people trying to buy their first home, particularly in Auckland. And you see this huge increase in the value of dairy farms, but you don't see the diversification of jobs and investment into other parts of the economy that we need to be a more balanced and stronger economy.
The trouble is, you try telling a local farmer that if he can get, X amount of money from a foreigner, but not as much from a local, who's he going to choose?
Yeah, well, they
that's
say
the balancing act, isn't it?
Well, it's actually if you strip that back, what that person is asserting wrongly is that their property right includes the right to sell to someone overseas. That's never been the case in New Zealand, and indeed until the 1980s, there was a virtual ban on selling our land, our rural land, to overseas people. What we've said is that we're going to really cut back on the discretion of the minister to agree to the sale of farms to overseas because we don't think it's in a long-term interest. Do you know that there was some controversy at the time when Shanghai Pengjin bought a lot of farms up in the North Island,
right.
the old Crayford farms there.
That's right. They could forget the Crayford farms.
Yeah, well, the government said they were going to tighten up on the rules around rural land sales to overseas people. Since then, they have not turned one down.
Is this part of, though, are you almost whipping up a culture of xenophobia, though?
No, you know, I was a businessman before I was elected. You know, I took one company from start-up to the main board of the stock exchange. I've been an entrepreneur most of my life. I actually like people to invest and make money. That's how commerce works, and we all get wealthier if they get rewarded for their effort. But I don't think we get wealthier as a country by selling off our land assets to overseas people. I think they should be priced within the means of New Zealanders. If we want New Zealanders to stay here and work hard here, people who work hard and save hard should be able to afford the best of our land assets, whether it's our houses or our farms, and I don't think they should be priced on an international market.
Nobody questions that house prices in Auckland are out of control. It's a similar situation in Christchurch, perhaps not quite as bad though. Has the horse already bolted though? Because how do we stop it? I mean, I can only think of a couple of solutions, and isn't that all about land supply?
Land supply is important, but it's not the only solution. You have to look at both supply and demand. On the supply side, you obviously have to look at there being enough sections available to house the people who need houses. You also need to make sure that there are enough affordable homes being built. In New Zealand, we build a lot of large homes, but we don't build as many small homes.
So how do we do it though? Because some would argue we don't actually have the tradespeople for a start. So what do we do there?
Well, that's an important but subsidiary issue. I mean, it's ridiculous that post the earthquakes, the government didn't predict the demand for builders and train a few extra, but they haven't. You know, the government's got to intervene sometimes, and the Labor has said when we get back into government, we're going to build some more affordable houses. We did it in the 50s. It needs to be done again now.
I mean, it sounds like nice to have, but how though? You're going to have to employ foreigners, aren't you? Dare I say it?
I actually don't have an objection to foreigners. First and foremost, we will employ and train New Zealanders. But you know, we've conceded that in Christchurch, you do need to have some people from overseas in order to meet the very sharp rise in demand to rebuild a city after an earthquake. But in general terms, you should train the people that you need for the industries that they need, for the industries that people need to work in. And we've said in respect of the Auckland housing crisis, the government needs to roll up its sleeve and build some houses through KiwiBuild. You also need to deal with some of the demand side factors. The tax system's got some role to play, and you also need to look at whether immigration is so weighted towards Auckland that it's actually throwing fat on the fire.
Okay, so let's try and get more of the immigration to come our way. But how do we do it though? I know your boss Andrew Little said Labor wants to develop a regional economic plan to try and stimulate the economies south of Auckland. By doing what though? How do you attract people this way?
Well, one of the things we've said is you need to encourage investment in the productive economy rather than the speculative economy, because that's where you earn your exports, and that's essentially, you know, an economy is a bit like a household. If you don't earn enough in your household, by the end of the year, you've either had to sell something or go into debt.
But the trouble is, the foreign investment isn't coming through. I remember Sarah and the government said, oh, don't worry, you know, the amount of foreign investment that will come to Christchurch following the earthquakes will be phenomenal. There's hardly any, to be fair. We're very lucky we've got the local developers that are putting their money where their mouths is.
Well, you know, the best solution is home savings. You know, universal KiwiSaver, which is one of the Labor Party policies, would see you having more capital to invest in your own country. But immigration also plays a role. At the last election, poo-hooed by the National Party, they said, we said that we should be having a regional immigration policy that encourages people to move to the regions where you've got skill shortages. You know, they're now proposing to do something different. But you know, as you say,
that sounds nice though. But give me your best sales pitch. How are we going to encourage migrants or immigration to come this way though?
Change the point system that gives them points for settling in the regions rather than settling in Auckland.
You think they'll do it? You think they'll come?
Some will, not all. But that's positive.
Christchurch isn't too bad, is it?
No, Christchurch is a good country, yeah.
Need to take a break. When we return, we'll discuss dairy and the rebuild of the city. That's next. welcome back to Lynched on CTV. My guest tonight is Labour's David Parker. David, I want to continue with the Auckland housing market because it does have an effect on Canterbury. In fact, you've said that in your opinion piece. You said foreign investment in Auckland's housing market is a lost opportunity for South Canterbury. What do you mean by that?
I was talking to the Timaru Herald journalist at the time, and if you misallocate capital, given that capital is always scarce and you want it to be invested in the way that best maximises, profits and jobs and salaries and wages and taxes, everything, it all goes around, you need to have a tax system that discourages speculative bubbles like we've got in Auckland, because they suck all the money in, people chasing this bubble, inflating it, and the opportunity cost, if you like, is the money is invested there instead of somewhere else like Canterbury.
But that's, as we discussed before the break, it's hard. It's hard to try, and it's almost like it's a marketing exercise, isn't it?
No, it's more than a marketing exercise. People respond to government rhetoric in part and government action. So if the government was to change the signals in the economy, for example, one of our policies at the last election was to increase depreciation rates, which is a tax write-off that you get for investing in productive equipment. Now, Christchurch, for example, has got a very sophisticated engineering and telecommunications industry. Now that industry would be better off financially. Hamilton Jet, for example, would be able to afford to invest in more equipment to be more competitive in their production of jet engines for marine craft around the world if they had more of a tax write-off for it. Well, instead in New Zealand we give a tax advantage to people who speculate in houses. Now if you fix those sorts of imbalances, you'll get the money flowing to the productive parts of the economy, and Christchurch is sure as rich in that.
I was speaking to a local developer the other day, and he was saying to me that all these trade missions to India and Sri Lanka, where CERA officials, government officials, have gone over there and said, "Oh, come to Christchurch. This is where the money is." And he said to me, "It's rubbish." He said, "Foreign investors are not going to bother investing in Christchurch. All these junkets to China and what have you are time wasters." Do you agree with that, or do you think there is some value in sending government officials overseas to say, look at us, we're doing so well now?
Well, I think you should be transparent and measure what comes as a consequence. You might not be able to measure it in a month, but you should be able to look back now after a number of years of these things and see if they're working, and if they're not working, or don't waste more money on them. In truth, the Christchurch rebuild is gathering pace. The Reserve Bank and the Treasury both estimate that it just about peaks either at the end of this year or next year, and then it'll start to tail off. There won't be quite as much in any one year, even though it's going to take a decade or so to finish off. You can see the building activity around town. That's great. I still feel very sorry for some of the people caught up in some of the eastern suburbs around, Brighton and the likes, where there hasn't been enough progress early enough. But overall, it's obvious that there is a lot of economic activity and a lot of rebuilding work now in Christchurch.
I was out recently on the east talking to people who are still doing it tough. The roads are still munted. There's still that sense of you've forgotten about us, which is incredibly sad to see. Now we've got CERA, who apparently is going to change its name, dress up in drag and become Regenerate Christchurch, another agency with the same staff, which is, it's all well intended, I'm sure, and we need obviously the government to intervene and to continue its support for Christchurch. But what about those living on the east, as you say? Who should be looking after them? Is it the council's responsibility or the government's?
Well, it's a bit of both, and the council's balance sheet is knocked around by the earthquake, so they can't do it alone, and they need some government support. One of the ideas that we've had is that there is a very, I think, suitable redevelopment project around the old Brighton commercial area, which has shrunk just through changing times, and it's not the destination that it once was, and it's crying out for redevelopment in a way that concentrates the retail area and then creates some space around it that would be a really good medium density housing area. The Christchurch city's already done the planning for it, and they need a partner. And we said, as if we were government, that's the sort of thing we would partner in, not to own the houses long term, but actually to give some hope to the people of the east and actually get that region cracking.
Just finally, Andrew Little says another bad season for dairy farmers could see New Zealanders lose some of its country's best agricultural land to offshore buyers. Is that just unnecessary scaremongering? Because the dairy industry, by and large, it goes around, it's cyclical, isn't it? Aren't we just experiencing an unfortunate downturn?
Well, that comes back to what you think about what's happening in the world at the moment. I don't know if you've read that book by Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century, you probably haven't, but it shows that there are incredible accumulations of wealth in a fraction of 1% around the world. And those people are, they have massive wealth relative to the wealth that we have in New Zealand. And I think there are some things that you should protect for New Zealand. if you sell those farms into overseas ownership, their output's not going to go up. Indeed, they're going to employ a New Zealand farmer. But something will be lost in New Zealand where those farms are priced on an international market rather than a New Zealand market where a young share milker who saves and works hard can save to buy a farm. So I think Andrew Little's quite right to be waving the flag. This current government said they were going to tighten things up after Shanghai Pengjin. Since then, they pretended to, but they haven't turned one farm sale
Has
down.
Fonterra unnecessarily panicked, though, by cutting jobs? Because it comes down to that cyclical effect, doesn't it? Eventually, it'll be back up again to where it was.
Oh, they had to react. They need to be investing more in their brands and going higher value rather than having a lot of middle tier managers, which are the people who they are mainly, making redundant. And it's very sad for the people who are made redundant, but it's also sad for the people who are living in our rural towns who are going to be suffering on diminished incomes as a consequence of the lower milk payout. So I won't criticise them for that.
Is our economy focused too much, an obsession on dairy? And there's all this, talk about diversification into what?
Well, some of the drive into dairying has been driven by the tax system where farmers retire on a large capital gain. Now, we've said that we're not going to take a capital gains tax, or I don't think we made a final decision, but Andrew's indicated that we're unlikely to take a capital gains tax into the next election. But there is something that needs to be done in the economy that encourages investment long term. It's interesting, I was visiting a new factory in Timaru just a couple of weeks ago, which is owned by Sumitomo Corporation, Japanese company that's juicing carrots and producing high value vegetable juices from different sorts of carrots that we haven't previously done. Why is it that they're doing that rather than a New Zealand investor? And you have to say it's because they've got a long-term view, they've got a view of the value chain, and they extract value higher up in the value chain for these sorts of products. Now, we should be encouraging the New Zealand economy in that sort of direction, rather than having all our eggs in the milk basket.
Nicely said. Just a few final comments from you. At one stage, I remember the good old days of Close Up, we had you in the studio because you wanted to become the leader of Labour. I know you're going to answer this very diplomatically. Any thoughts on that now?
Well, look, I lost that, and that's life in politics. You get used to losing in politics.
Did you ever say to David Cunliffe, "I told you so"?
No, not at all. Yeah, no. Look, Andrew won by a considerable margin. I was third. I wasn't even second. I don't, I don't begrudge that.
Oh, you third, were you?
I was third.
Oh, there's no hope for you then, is there?
That's right. I'm a loser.
David, nice to see you.
Okay.
Thank you for your time,
See
David Parker, everybody. And that is our show. Don't forget to join me for News Talks ZB. We start at 8:35 tomorrow. Christchurch Mealy Dalzell is back again for the weekly Mirror Report. But from everyone here at CTV, have a great night.